Welcome to another episode of Booray Explains, and today we're going to talk about exposure compensation. Before we get started, don't forget to check out my podcast. It's called Photobomb. It's available anywhere that podcasts are found. Also, check out my new merch. I've got merch now on the channel. It's right below this video that you're watching right now. Grab yourself a Camera Nerd t-shirt or a hoodie or a one camera, one lens t-shirt, which, yeah, if you're a Fuji X100V user, then one camera, one lens. That's your motto. Also, be sure and follow me on Instagram. Just go to @BourayPerry on Instagram. I got a fun channel there. All right, let's talk about exposure compensation today. This is one of those things that I think if you're a new photographer and you're trying to wrap your head around all the concepts and the things that I've been teaching in this series, and then along comes exposure compensation, and it can be a little confusing when it really shouldn't be confusing because it's just kind of a catch-all word for something that you do with your camera that you would describe in a different way if it wasn't for this word. Right. That makes sense? You got that? So the place where you most often see exposure compensation is on some cameras. For example, on my Fuji X100 here, there is a dial right here. See this dial? There it is. And this is your exposure compensation dial. And this is so that you can change the exposure in your camera. +1, +2, +3, -1, -2, -3, and so on. Now, on some of the bigger cameras, the DSLRs and stuff like that, there won't be a dedicated dial for exposure compensation, but there will be a wheel somewhere on the camera that will do exposure compensation, or you can program a dial to do exposure compensation. And I think where it trips people up is that you think, well, it's exposure compensation. So like, I've got my exposure, right? That's my picture. And if I go to +1, then my picture is going to be one stop brighter. And if I go to -1, it's going to be one stop less bright. By the way, if you don't know what stops are, what f-stops are, then all you have to do is go to the Booray Explains video on my channel about that. I'll put a link up for you. So yes, correct. That is what it does. It just changes your exposure. The thing is how it changes your exposure. And that entirely depends on what settings you have your camera set to when you use the exposure compensation dial. So for example, if you are shooting in aperture priority mode, so you are setting the aperture on your camera, but your camera is setting your ISO and your shutter speed for you. If you then use the exposure compensation dial to change your exposure, it will change your exposure by changing your shutter speed or your ISO. But it won't change your aperture because you're in aperture priority mode. You control the aperture and you let the camera take care of the other two things. So when you say, change my exposure compensation, just change my exposure for me, plus or minus, it decides which one of those two things it's going to adjust. How does it decide? Well, different cameras have different ways of deciding, but usually there are limits that you've programmed into the camera. So you've told the camera, for example, I never want my shutter speed to go below 160 and I never want my ISO to go above 3200. So it will change whichever one of those it can change without going outside the parameters that you have set. And I know this now is starting to sound very technical and computery, like programming. What are the parameters that you've set in the program inside your camera? And it's really not that difficult. It's just very simple. If you are using a program mode in your camera that allows you to control part of the exposure triangle, either aperture or shutter speed or ISO, then the camera will control whatever you've allowed it to control. So it won't change the thing that you specifically want to keep control of. And this is why exposure compensation is a handy tool to have on a camera. Because if you're in, say, aperture priority, and you're shooting and you want to control your aperture, you've already decided that you really don't care much about the shutter speed and the ISO, right? I'll let the camera take care of that. I don't care which one it changes. So having an exposure compensation dial or having a dial on your camera set to exposure compensation means that when you see your picture and it's not as bright as you want it to be or it's not as dark as you want it to be, you can just turn that dial and the camera will figure out what to do. But it won't mess with the aperture because that's what you want to control. And that's the whole purpose of using a pre-made program type thing in your computer, is that you don't want to have to worry about every step in the exposure triangle. By the way, there is a video about the exposure triangle as well in this series. Up here. It's somewhere. Pew pew. And so using exposure compensation is just an easier way of having to say, I want this to be darker. Okay, well, I'll change my shutter speed, or I'll change my ISO, or I'll change my shutter speed, but wait a minute, my shutter speed will go too low, so I need to change my ISO. So you don't have to do all this thinking. The camera will do it for you. You just change your exposure compensation dial, and it will figure out what has to be done to get you where you want to go. So it's really a very simple little thing. It's kind of a nice little catch-all. It just basically says, let the camera take over and do this for me. That's exposure compensation. And I hope that you've got it now. And when you use it, you'll have a better understanding of how it works. I also hope that you will take the time to subscribe and to like this channel. And be sure and click the notifications button so that you'll get notifications every time that I come out with a new video. And this is especially true if you are participating in the new image review that I am doing. I have a new thing I'm doing called image review. I'm starting off with the Fuji X100V, and people are submitting pictures from this camera, and I'm going to be reviewing them and talking about them and trying to teach a little bit right here on YouTube. So you need to know every time we launch a new one so that you can get your images in and become a part of the community as well. All right, so be sure and click the notify button. All right, that's it. Stick around. There's more videos like this one on the way. I'm going to make you a photographer one way or the other.